You all know who Matt is. You all have worked with Matt. Matt's a third generation. Second generation lobsterman. And he's also our youngest selectman. And it's so nice for all of us who are older to have a person in their 40s who's like helping us along.
Yeah, I guess. I feel like I'm older than 40, but.
But the thing with Matt is he does so many things. I didn't realize that you were a wrestler in high school.
I was.
And Chuck was your coach.
He was.
Yeah.
He was. I've known Chuck for a long time.
But he's also, I don't know if any of you happened to see the piece that was on Channel 13 this week, where Matt talked about the Fisheries Committee that Jay is also on, and how you've really worked with a number of your fishermen friends and buddies and coworkers to take food, and it's over 500 pounds of food now that have been donated, and Harps Legion at Home cooks take care of processing it and delivering it, and the food that has gone out has been just amazing. So that is a wonderful partnership. So proud of you.
I'm Matt Gilley. I grew up about a quarter mile down the road here at the head of Cundy's Harbor on Field Road. And we moved up the road to Oak Ledge as my parents built the house as life went on. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank a couple people before I start, because as Lily said, I'm 41 years old. In terms of the fishing community, I'm young in that industry as well. The average age of a lobsterman nowadays is over 61. So I'm about 20 years younger than the average age. So there are quite a few people that are better or more knowledgeable to speak about the history than myself. But here I am, and I have to thank a few folks for filling me full of knowledge. Frankie Beechrist, Robert Watson, Dave Hackett, Glenn Rogers, Kevin Johnson, my grandparents, the Harpswell Historical Society. Most of the information I'm going to share with you today are from one of those people, or probably somebody that I forgot. So I'm going to talk about the history of fishing in Harpswell, and I'm going to focus specifically kind of on the Cundy's Harbor area, because this is where I'm from, and this is kind of where my knowledge centers around. So where is Cundy's Harbor? That X got moved apparently. The X used to be over here, because that's where Cundy's Harbor is, not over here. Hence, you're seeing the problems with the fishermen running technology. And the reason that Cundy's Harbor became such a huge fishing port is because of its location. It's right here. It's situated at the end of the New Meadows River, which starts way up here in West Bath and flows out through here. And it gets you out into pretty well open ocean pretty quickly. You only got a mile to get by Cundy's Point there, and you have the shelter of the island, so it was a good anchorage when the settlers first came over in the early 1600s. This is an early map. 1795, I think, is when that map was drawn up. The first settlers were actually the indigenous people. The Abenaki tribes came here in the summer, the spring, and the fall, and they would clam, lobster, suckerfish, alewives, with fish spears and stuff like that. And they did that for generations and generations. They would salt and dry their fish, and they would pack it inland as the bays froze over and there was no more resources for them to gather out of the ocean when it became wintertime. As time kept moving on, the English came over and found Cundy's Harbor and found Harpswell, and slowly the Indians got driven away, and that will be an important point that we're going to visit later on in this presentation, because it's funny how history kind of tends to repeat itself. Some of the earlier settlers over here came here because this area was so plentiful with fish. First came over in the 1600s, and fishing quickly became a means for survival for people over here. It wasn't an industry, it was a way for people to eat and survive. Between fishing and farming, that was how everybody fed themselves back in the day. There was no Hannaford or Shaw's, obviously, to go to back in that time. So what they would do is they would harvest fish, lobsters, clams, and a lot of it was dried and salted in front of their houses and stuff, and that way they were able to store it. There was no ice at this time, really. Ice will come into play here later in around the 1800s or so. And Cundy's Harbor was a reliable place to fish because it was so quick to get out into deep water, and you had the New Meadows River, and a lot of your fish species, your cod, your haddock, your herring, all came up into the bays to spawn in the springtime. So There was a huge whiting fishery here back in the 1950s and 40s. And because the fish were so plentiful, they didn't have to go far. I mean, now I travel almost 30 miles to get to my furthest lobster trap. These guys were only going as far as you could see. They were barely going beyond the horizon. There was a lot more fish, a lot more lobsters back then, and that created the boom that we began to see in the early 1800s. I'm going to share a couple of interesting stories. In the 1774, I believe it was, there was a British ship that was coming into all the different harbors here. They'd come into Cundy's Harbor, they'd come over in a small point, and they came over on the other side of Harpswell, and they were basically robbing everybody's livestock, fish, stuff like that. And there was a gentleman by the name of Nathaniel Purington and another gentleman, I want to say James Coundys. It was Coundys, and that is where Cundy's Harbor eventually got its name from. The O was dropped as time passed down there. They dropped the O and it became Cundy's. But these two gentlemen took it upon themselves that they decided they were going to put a stop to the British ship. They jumped in a 14-foot punt and they rowed over to Small Point, and they got in a bigger sailboat and they took to chase after the British. They found them just south of Seguin, and they caught up to them a little past Seguin. There was 4 of them. I can't remember the names of the other 2. And they boarded the British ship, killed all the soldiers, snapped the mast off it, and towed the ship back here to Cundy's Harbor. And they used some of that wood to build some of the wharfs. And one of the soldiers is actually buried. If you're standing at the head of Cundy's Harbor, there's a little island on your left, and they buried those British soldiers on the southern end of that island. I, as a kid, went out there many times looking to see if I could find the grave, and I never did. Like I said, that is what made James Coundys kind of famous. When word got back to the king that he had gone and done this, and he was given a deed to basically what we know today as Great Island or Sebasco-Deegan Island, he owned the entire thing at one point, and that's why this became Cundy's Harbor, because this was the main harbor where all the fishing took place. He owned it also back in the day. That's usually how stuff got its name. This is an early photo. I'm sure you're all familiar with Watson's General Store. That was built in around the 1850s. The Watson's family came from down in Gloucester, Massachusetts. They had 4 different schooners. Rumor has it that they disassembled one of those schooners and used the wood from the schooner to build the wharf in the store that is there today. If you've ever been into the store, over where the cash register is the original store. That hasn't changed. They've replaced some boards, obviously, here and there, but that's the original store. Where you first walk in is an addition that was built later on. This is the tide mill over at Basin Cove. That was important over on the other side of Harpswell, because farming, like I said, was another huge part of Harpswell back in the day. Between fishing and farming, that's how you fed yourself. And they used the tide mill at Basin Cove to grind grain into flour and stuff like that. Shipbuilding obviously had to take place too back in the day. Everybody built their own boats. In the 1800s up and through the 1900s, there was anywhere from 5 to 10 boats being built in Harpswell every year. Guys would work together, help each other out. They would start by building models. They would build these boats on a much smaller scale, but everything would be to scale. So they would take these models and they would bring them down to the shop, and they would just be able to enlarge everything, to scale, and build the boat off of the model that they had designed in their home. And as you can see, it's actually missing a couple. There was another boatyard right here, where you can see they had snow yard, pennel yard. I mean, the other side of Harpswell, where the neck was where a lot more of the boat building happened than down in Cundy's Harbor per se. There was a lot of boats built at the top of Field Road, just down the road here in Freeman Davis's shop. As well, a few are actually still fishing today. Fishing back then was the economy here. There was no other economy. It was fishing and farming. So much so that I'll jump ahead a little bit. In 1972, 74% of the people that lived in Cundy's Harbor were fishermen. They didn't have census data from back then, but I'd be willing to bet it was close to 100% of the people were either a fisherman or a spouse of a fisherman or a child of a fisherman back then. And they would fish. There wasn't as much regulation back then as there is now. So they would go out and they would fish for whiting. When the whiting were plentiful, as the whiting started to piddle off, they'd go lobstering and they'd catch lobsters. When the lobsters started to dry up, they'd go shrimping. When the shrimp started to dry up, they'd go cohogging. So there wasn't a government per se to tell them this is how much you can catch or this is when you can go. It was, they had to survive. So they went and they caught what was available at the time. There was no season, there was no licenses, there was no permits back then. It was a different way of life. It was a lot more work back then, though, too. One of the big types of fisheries that they had back then was tub trawling, and I have an older version of one up here. They'd stick this in the back of the boat, and they'd haul the tub trawl in over the roller here, and that's how they'd catch a lot of cod, haddock. A lot of your ground fish were caught that way. There wasn't really, nets didn't really become effective until later on in the 1800s. Tub trawling was the way they did it. So every fish was caught on a hook, and there was very little bycatch back then. Back, obviously, before we had engines, everybody was either rowing or sailing. Even your first lobster boats were sailboats, or they rowed in a punt type of thing. You got to imagine, you're trying to pull up to a pot with a sailboat, gaff a buoy, while dropping the sail and hauling the pot in. These guys were far better seamen than I could ever dream of being. What they would do is, if they were going for haddock, the most popular bait was mussels or clams. So they would have to go out before they went out in their boats, and they would have to either dig clams or pull mussels off the rocks, and they would crack the shell of the mussel so they wouldn't smash it and pull the meat out. They'd crack it so the fish could see the meat, and then they would take one of these hooks here, and they would bait each individual hook, and there was anywhere from 200 to 500 hooks per trawl. And a trawl is anywhere from, a short one's like 500 feet, a long one's 2,500 feet. There'd be anywhere from a fathom is 6 feet, a fathom to 3 fathom, 6 to 18 feet in between hooks. Everybody kind of had their own idea of what they thought worked best. For cod, whiting, some of your smaller ground fish, they would use the clams and the mussels. If they were going after more like a tuna or some of your bigger cod, stuff like that. Alewives or heron was a popular bait. And they were able to, back then, they were so plentiful, you could walk down on the shore with a dip net and just make a scoop and catch a net full of heron and alewives in the spring, because the alewives would run up the New Meadows River to spawn. And tub trawling was really the first way that they commercially caught fish in large quantities. Before, it was just one guy with a hook on a pole or a stick, and tub trawling gave them the ability to set multiple hooks at a time. And that was what really began industrializing the fishing industry. And obviously, when you catch all these fish, you have to process them. One of the first ways they did it was they would dry them. So they would have these big drying racks, and it was basically just a wooden frame with either twine or rope stretched between them, and they would hang the fish on them out in the sun, and they'd have to go out and flip them once a day, and then at night they would cover them with either canvas or burlap to keep the gulls and the other animals from taking them away. And then they'd have to go out in the morning, take that canvas or burlap off, and flip the fish again. So, and it would take, depending on the weather, they were drying from a couple of days, 4 or 5 days, to anywhere to 2 weeks. If it was real humid and wet out, it would take much longer for them to dry. And guys would dry anywhere from 5 to 1,000 pounds of fish a year to get them through the winters. It's a significant amount when you're talking about individuals going out, catching all these fish, gutting all these fish, filleting all these fish, setting them all out on a drying rack, going out, flipping them over once a day, and then covering them at night, all while they're still going fishing too, mind you. So I can't even understand how difficult it had to be back then just to survive. This is the whiting factory at Watson's, and the women were hired as, they were usually the fish cutters. They were the ones that worked in the factory. They cut the heads off, pull the guts out, and process the fish that way. And the men were the ones that were usually the ones going out and catching the fish. The women were the ones that usually processed them and cooked them as well. And they were, if the guy was lucky enough to have a wife, they would help out a lot with that drying process as well, and that's what gave the guy the ability to go fish. The entire community really kind of took part in it, and it still does today. If anybody ever has a problem out there on the water, I would drop anything and go help anybody. You know, there's not a wrecker company that we call when we break down out there. You call another fisherman and they come and they tow you in, and it was no different back then. The fishing community was always a big on community. If there was a guy that was injured or had had a mishap or something, other guys would step up and share some of their catch with him to get him by until he was back in shape. So the community itself as a whole really made this operation work. Like I said, back then, even in the 70s, 74% of the community were fishermen. Back in the 1800s and early 1900s, almost everybody was in some form or another, whether they were going out and catching the fish or working in the processing plant to cut and clean and dry them. And whiting was really one of the first large-scale fisheries that we saw here in Cundy's Harbor. The New Meadows River was just inundated with whiting. I talked to an old-timer that said they were so thick that if you fell off a boat back then, you wouldn't drown. You could stand on the fish. I mean, they were that thick. And you'll see pictures later on, and back in, believe it was 88, the pogies were the same way, and we had a big pogie die-off here. I was 5 at the time, and I remember playing down on my grandparents' beach up to my thighs in dead fish and having the time of my life. My parents weren't thrilled, but it was good fun back then. But it was the same back then, but it was with the whiting, the herring, everything like that. And another reason that a lot of these fish came further into the bays than they do now is they spawn at night. And there were very few lights back then. We didn't have street lights. Electricity was just coming about, you know, as we got later on in life there. But these fish spawn at night, so everything was much darker back then. You didn't have all this ambient light that there is nowadays, so everything would come all the way up to the head of the bays to spawn. Now there's so much more light pollution around in the world, everything spawns further offshore. They just don't come as far up into the bays as they used to because there's more light. And they understand if there's light, the predators can see them. That's why they come and they do it at night. They don't have to worry about the birds, the eagles, the seagulls, and everything like that diving on them and feasting on them. This is a great example here of what the drying racks used to look like. There's, and as you can see, like you were asking, you know, the women certainly took part in this as well. And you can see all the fish hanging down. It just gives you an idea of the scale of it. It's just pretty darn impressive. And this is another early picture, and you can see these are all drying racks down here as well, where they were drying fish. It does look a lot like Watson's, but there's not the hill there. You know what I mean? It might be down towards Holbrook's a little bit more.
That's actually Prince's store.
Is it? All right. Well, we have a gentleman that knows. We'll get into the early 1900s here. Fishing to find Harpswell and Cundy's Harbor in the 1900s. This is an early picture. This is Watson's store. This is Watson's store down here, and that's the head of Cundy's Harbor up there. And you can see there was a lot less trees back then than there is now, and that was because farming was so prevalent. They had cleared a lot of the land because they were using it for farming, and they used a lot of the wood to build the boats too. So obviously, as you built the boats, you lose a few trees, but most of it was cleared just for the farming aspect of it. And that's when lobstering, which is the area that I'm obviously the most knowledgeable about because I'm a lobsterman, came into place. And one of the first traps that they created was called the stovepipe trap, were on the ends of the trap. And they had a spike in the middle of the trap that they'd put the bait on, so the lobsters would walk in either end. And they had what they call standard heads. They were flat, basically. If you look at the heads on this trap, the lobster would walk in and then fall down. So even in today's wire traps, we only keep about 10% of the lobsters that walk into the trap. 90% of them get back out. So back then, that percentage was much higher. And they were built by wood, and a lot of guys would go out and they would cut spruce boughs, and they would bend the spruce bough in a circle, and lash it together with twine, and everybody would knit their own heads. And then they would do the same thing with the bows of the trap, which is basically the frame of it, the big pieces of wood in the middle that are bent in a U shape. They'd go out and they would cut spruce, and they would either get it wet or steam it and bend it into that shape and then let it dry. And then there was different, some guys would mill their own larves, which are the flat wooden pieces that you see on the top, or there were a few companies around. The biggest one was in North Yarmouth. It was called Anderson Trap, that would make their own larves, and guys would go buy them in bulk instead of milling their own. That came about in like 1840s or so, 1830s is when lobster really started to pick up, and they designed the trap. And Cundy's Harbor was the first place in Maine that they bought a lobster commercially. So Cundy's Harbor was the beginning of lobstering. And back in the day, I'm sure you've all seen what our measures look like today, where we measure them from the eye socket to the back of their back. When it started, they measured the entire length of the lobster. It was 10.5 inches. They'd measure from the tip of the tail to the tip of the nose, and it had to be 10.5 inches long. And that was about the same size lobster that we catch nowadays. They would be about 1.25 pounds. They did have another use, though. That wasn't a law. That was kind of a shared industry standard. But guys obviously caught smaller lobsters, and they would can those. They would cook them, and they would can them into cans, and that would be stored over winter. When they finally codified the lobster measure in the rule, they codified it at 10.5 inches, and that eliminated the canneries, because there were no more small lobsters to can anymore, and they couldn't compete. It wasn't profitable for them to try to buy that 10.5 inch lobster, boil it down, and put it into a can. There just wasn't enough meat there for them to make a profit off of it. So that's what eliminated the canning industry. Canada still has a canning industry. Prince Edward Island, they're allowed to, the smallest lobster we could keep is 3.25 inches. In Prince Edward Island, Canada, they could keep lobsters that are 3 inches, and those lobsters are canned still today. So canning is still happening today, but not in the United States. And then, as time went on, they built this trap where you see the heads on the side. And then there was a head in the middle of the trap. You had your bait on the bait line. The lobster would walk in to get the bait, fall down, and then it would take the path of least resistance, which is into the back of the trap, which we would call the parlor or the bedroom. And then there's almost no way for it to get out. It would have to kind of either, if it was a big lobster, it would have to swim back up and crawl back out that head. Or if it was a small one, it could fit between the larves. And that was a much more efficient trap. It held on to a lot more of the lobsters. There was no limit on traps. Now we're allowed to fish 800, but they had to build their own traps. So a guy with a lot of traps back in the early 1900s, late 1800s might have 200, 250 traps. And they'd go out and they'd haul them a couple times a week, but they'd go out and they'd haul 200, 250 traps, and they'd have 2,500, 3,000 pounds. And some guys would haul them more than once a day when they were thick. That's when everything started to pick up. As well as making the traps, they had to make their buoys too. So they'd go and they'd whittle their buoys out of a piece of wood, and they painted them back then as well. Everybody had their own individual colors so they could tell them apart from everybody else. Just the time and effort that went into building a trap, building a buoy. Their rope was all cotton, and they had to make their own rope as well. There was a lot more work in it back then. They'd have to add rocks as well to the traps because they were made out of wood. And I remember it even as a kid, because I started with wooden traps, every now and then a guy would forget to put rocks in his traps when he set them, and you'd see lobster traps floating down New Meadows River because they didn't sink, they floated. And once the wood soaked up enough water, it lost its buoyancy, and they could remove those rocks, and you would see piles of rocks on the shoreline here, and they were buoyancy rocks. They were rocks that once guys went and collected them, they didn't want to go and collect them every year, so they'd save them in a pile by where they kept their boats. and they'd be able to, at the beginning of the year, they'd be able to go down and pick up what they needed to set their traps. They didn't have the modern day sounding machines like we had. They had a lead weight attached to a rope, and they had a hole in their boat, and they'd have hard wax around it. And what they'd do is they'd go out and they'd drop the sounding weight down, and it would hit bottom, and then they'd have different marks on the rope that would tell them how deep it was, and they would pull the rope up, and as it came through the wax, whatever the bottom composition was, if there was a little bit of sand stuck on the lead weight, or if it was mud, would get stuck on that wax, and they would be able to tell what the bottom composition was. And the other way they did it was by what they called marks and running time. So they would know, all right, if I steam south for 2 hours and I line the old water tower up with the oak tree by Mr. Smith's house, I know I'm at X point, and that's where I want to be. And these marks were passed down through generations. Guys used to have old log books or mark books that they would write these different marks in. And talking to some older folks, that was one of the reasons they had a hard time seeing the water tower disappear. Not because they cared about the water tower, but it was a navigational and a fishing mark that they'd used for generations. And the same with some of the trees and some of the older houses. As we've seen some of these disappear, they're marks that have been lost that can't be recreated. And nowadays we have GPSs, and if you took a guy my age, my father started me out, he gave me a map and he gave me a compass, and he would give me marks, and he'd say, if you're at this point, you take this bearing and you head this way for so long, and you should run into this. And I still remember it. He gave it the mark from, I fished out of Ridley Cove, and I'd start at Birch Island, and it was 172 degrees, and I should have hit Flash Island. Well, one day I was off by a couple degrees, and it was foggy out, and I missed. And I realized it when I ran into Ragged Island. I didn't hit the island, but Ragged Island appeared out of the fog. And it just goes to show you, I mean, I was only off by a couple of degrees, but these guys were doing it with no radios. You know, I at least had a VHF, you know, that I could call somebody. And they were doing it all by either logbooks or knowledge that was in their head passed down through generations. That was a thing that I wish could have been passed down that wasn't, you know, a lot of those old marks. It's something that we could still use today if we ever lost a GPS or our compass or anything like that. It was a valuable piece of information that I wish we had done a better job at recording. The other thing they would do is they would row out and they would chase tuna fish as well. And they were chasing these tuna fish in little 16, 18-foot rowboats, and they'd harpoon them, and they'd go for what they call the Nantucket sleigh ride. They'd stick the harpoon into the tuna fish, and they'd tie it off to the bow of the boat, and they'd let the fish tow them until it tired out. And then when it tired out, it would die, float to the surface, and they hauled it in. They didn't have any control over where this fish dragged them, and wherever they ended up, they would then have to look, all right, what can I see for land and what marks do I recognize in order to get back? So they had hundreds, if not thousands, of different marks that they used for every type of fishery. It was how they would decide when and where to set their nets. If a guy would tear his net up when they started dragging, he would take a mark of that and say, hey, look, there's either a big rock down here or a shipwreck or something that tears you up, and stay away from this. And those are the marks that would get shared between the whole community. The marks that would get passed down generationally are the marks that were, well, this is a good spot to catch lobsters in June, or this is where the tuna fish are in July. Your fishing marks are the ones that guys kept close to their chest and didn't really pass down except to family members. Here's another older picture of Cundy's Harbor. You can see the head of the harbor is up here, and this is Watson's down here. Everywhere was farmland for the most part. A lot of Cundy's Harbor, and especially, I believe, over on the other side of Hartfield. There was one way down on the point, too. And the next one up was, I believe, always called Lily's Farm, across from Dingley Island Road there. The other big establishment besides Watson's in Cundy's Harbor was Holbrook's. And Holbrook's was the first place they really started buying lobsters. They were a bigger lobster buyer than Watson's was originally. Watson's came into play later on. But Holbrook's was your one-stop for everything. They were a grocery store, they had ice, they had fish, and they would process fish there as well. The whiting fishery fished out of Holbrook's when the whiting fishery was in existence. I have a picture later on of the whiting boats moored up outside of Holbrook's. But these are two gentlemen here. This isn't Harpswell, but this is how they would haul by hand. They would row out to their traps, and they would haul them up by hand, and they would pull the lobsters out. Here's another bigger picture of that stovepipe trap I was talking about. These are the original traps where they had the heads on the end, on each end, and they had the bait spike in the middle. When they came in with their lobsters back then, they didn't have bands, first of all. They had plugs, and they were little pieces of wood that were whittled into a wedge, and you would jam that wedge into the joint where the claw would open, and that would prevent the claw from opening. We eventually got rid of those because the problem is everybody just kind of let them lay in the bottom of the boat with the diesel, the gas, the oil, every other pollutant that may have been there, and you're taking that plug that could have soaked up all these pollutants and you're jamming it into the meat of the lobster, and then you're asking somebody to consume that. It wasn't the healthiest thing. Another funny story, I used to work, one of my first jobs was working for Frankie Beechrist, and he thought it would be funny to teach me how to plug lobsters one day. And he had some old plugs, so he brought some plugs out, and he had me plug all the lobsters that day. And then we went in to sell, and we got in the cellar, and we started loading them in the crate, and the guy saw that we'd plugged them. He goes, what the hell did you do? He goes, I taught him how to plug them like we used to back in the day. He goes, I can't buy these. He goes, this is why we outlawed it. He goes, you just jammed polluted plugs into the meat. So we had to pull all the plugs out and then had to reband them. I'll never plug lobsters again. But the way they would store them after they came in and sold them were in lobster cars. They were built out of wood. They could hold, you could build them to whatever size you wanted. Some of the bigger ones would hold 3,000 to 5,000 pounds of lobsters. And there's another picture up top here. This is one on land. And they'd put them out in the water, and they'd put all the lobsters inside there, and that's how they could keep them alive. And they also, the other thing they did is they built pounds. There was 2 pounds here in Cundy's Harbor. One outside of Watson's, which you could still kind of see today if you look up the store window. And there was another one at the end of Holbrook Street here that was also built by the Watsons. And they would store the lobsters in these pounds until the wintertime when the prices went up. And they would sell them then when the price was higher in the wintertime than it was when they caught them in the summer. Not all of them obviously stayed in the pound. Some of them were able to escape and stuff like that, and you would have dead loss. What eventually began to eliminate the pounds was a disease called red tail. It was a bacteria that the lobsters got, and lobsters are cannibalistic. So once one entered that pound and had that red tail and died, another one would eat it and catch the red tail, and it spread rampantly through the pounds, and they eventually had to eliminate the pounds because there was just too much dead loss to make up for the profit that they were making by holding on to them later on when the price was higher. This is a great example of how many fish there used to be. This is the head of the New Meadows River where the New Meadows Marina was. This is in 1988. Everything you see here, those are all dead pogies. What happened was pogies are cyclical, and usually the cycle was about 7 years. You would see pogies for about 7 years, and then they would disappear for 7 years, and then come back in 7 years. And this year, when they came in, there were obviously millions, and if not billions of them, and the bluefish would chase them. And bluefish are saltwater piranhas, basically. And they would drive these big schools up into the head of the harbors, and there was so many fish there, the oxygen would be depleted almost instantly. As soon as that oxygen was depleted, it was like sucking the air out of this room, and we wouldn't last very long. We'd all suffocate, and that's what happened to the fish. It was so bad, and it smelled so bad that it peeled paint off of the houses in the New Meadows River. I remember it down at our house. The paint was literally just falling off of it. And I'm grateful for that time because still to this day, I don't even recognize the smell of dead fish. You could have one in my truck right now and I wouldn't even notice it. I'm immune to that sense of smell after that year. They did a survey after that over in Quahog Bay. There was divers that went down and they were 6 feet deep on the bottom of Quahog Bay of dead pogies. And we went close to 10 years and we couldn't catch a lobster in Quahog Bay. Why could you? There was tons of food for them on bottom, and there was no oxygen there for the lobsters either. All the lobsters migrated out of the bay. And the other thing that made it a challenge is the other thing besides lobster bait that pogies are used for is that's where a lot of your fish oil comes from if you take fish oil pills. Pogies are a very oily fish. So when they died, there was a sheen across the water, and this sheen, that oily sheen, would cover the buoys. And I remember going out to haul with my father, and you'd try to grab a buoy, and it'd just slide right out of your hands. It was like they'd rubbed Crisco all over the things. They were impossible to grab a hold of. The other way that they stored stuff besides drying stuff is in the 1850s, there's a pond on Dingley Island called Goddard's Ice Pond. And they built a dam out of granite that stopped the seawater from coming in and impounded that pond. And they used that pond as an ice pond. They used to have a wharf set up on shore, and all the boats that they'd come as far from New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, they'd steam up to Maine to go to the sword fishing grounds, and they couldn't keep ice. It'd take them a few days or a few weeks, depending on the weather, to get up here from these destinations further south in New England. And whatever ice they may have started with had melted at this point. So they would stop in Cundy's Harbor here a lot of the times and pick up ice at Goddard's Ice Pond and load the boats with ice, go out to the fishing grounds, catch their fish. Most of that ice would melt again while they were out there, and they'd stop in again on their way back to port and pick up more ice. The ice industry was huge here. Everybody kind of went by here because Portland was a huge port to sell your fish. But they didn't have the ice ponds that we had here. There was one here, there's one down on Gun Point. The other side of Hartsville had one as well. And these were in existence until the early 1900s when refrigeration finally came about, and that's what eliminated all the ice ponds. Is once we came out with refrigeration, it just wasn't economically feasible for guys to be going down and cutting big chunks of ice, dragging them up with horses, and then sliding them down onto the boats when you could put reefers and refrigeration in boats. They had what they called hogsheads barrels, and these barrels would hold, so 25 bushels. So you think about, everybody's seen a fish tray. If you've seen a fish tray, that's 2 bushel. So these barrels are holding 12, 14 of those fish trays full of lobsters. And the first way they did it is they'd pack the lobsters in the barrels, and then they put the ice on top of the lobsters, and they tried shipping them. They didn't make it very far because as the ice melted and drained down over the lobsters would suck in that fresh water and die. So then they came up with the idea, they lined the outside of the barrel with like seaweed or kelp, and then they put the ice in along the sides of the barrels, put another layer of seaweed or kelp, and then put the lobsters in, put a layer of seaweed and kelp on top of the lobsters, and then put the ice on top of that. And that insulated it much better. And they were able to ship lobsters back in the 1800s out to the Midwest with just ice in barrels. Now we ship them all over the world, but for back in when they were shipping everything by train, it obviously took much longer than it does now by plane. And the fact that they were able to get these lobsters alive out to the Midwest using ice in barrels was pretty remarkable. And that's what opened up and made lobstering more of a global fishery. It opened up more markets for us. It opened up more demand. An older gentleman I talked to started fishing in the 1940s. A lobster trap was $6, brand new, and a lobster was anywhere from 15 to 20 cents a pound. But they were catching 2 to 2,500 pounds of lobsters a haul, so even at 18 cents and a $6 trap, you know, to put it in perspective, today I'm getting paid $6 a pound, and I just bought new traps last week, and they were $240 a piece. So the price of lobsters has not kept up with the price of expenses And obviously, when we went to wire traps, it also created other problems. As you can see, the wooden traps, they'd have to take them up every year because there were worms out there. And if you didn't take the traps up and dry them, a trap would not last a full year. The worms would eat the wood, and there'd be nothing left in a year. That's why they use pressure-treated wood when they build the wharfs and docks nowadays, is that's the only thing that keep these worms at bay. We use oak runners some of the time now on our lobster traps, and if I use an oak runner, I get 18 months out of it before the worms eat it away completely, and it has to be replaced. So there's other type of wood. There's a type of wood we use now called jungle wood. What was the name of that, Fair and Mighty? The type of wood that this was, Fair and Mighty?
Lignovitis.
Lignovitis, what he said. And that jungle wood is similar to that. It's a really dense, hard wood, and the worms won't eat it, or they haven't in 6 years. That and steel runners is the other thing we use now to keep the worms from eating it. But these guys would have to take their traps up every year, and the only way to kill the worms was to dry them, because the worms would dry out and suffocate and die in the air. The other thing they'd have to do is, as these runners wore down, we have vents in our traps that allow the smaller lobsters to get out. They actually measured the distance in between these larvae, and that was their vents, per se, on the wooden traps, was how far apart they put each one of those larvae was about 1.75 inches. I remember as a kid, my dad had a piece of wood that we'd use when we'd take the traps up, and we'd take the piece of wood and we'd try to stick it in between each larva. And if it went in between a larva, we knew the gap was too big, and we had to replace that one. So we'd rip that one off and put a new one in its place and make sure that piece of wood wouldn't stick in again. And that's how you kept that gap small enough so the legal lobsters couldn't get out and the smaller ones could. We baited our traps with fish. Has always been used. We've used everything over the years, but fish is the most effective. Guys would either catch their fish or they would buy it from other guys that went out and caught the fish. And some of the times they would use just the racks that were left over after people filleted the fish out. Nothing went to waste back then. Everything was used. They would stick the fish onto the bait iron. There's a piece of twine that the bait iron, there's a little tab on the end of it here that would hook the string, and you'd push the fish down, and that way they'd all go onto the string, and then you'd tie the string onto the trap, and that's how you'd bait the trap. What we do now is, you can see this one doesn't have a hole in it, or our bait irons now. These haven't changed much over the years. I have a friend that still uses them like this. The ones I have look very similar, except there's a small hole right here, and you put that string up through the hole and do it that way. It just makes it easier. When you're walking all around, you're trying to get it to stay in that little notch, isn't always the easiest thing to do it, whereas if you could stick it through that hole, it's less apt to fall out of that hole than it was that notch. We have 3 foot, 4 foot, 4.5 foot, and 5 foot traps now. Back then, most of them were 2.5 to 3 foot traps. The first type of haulers that came out were on gas-powered motors or horizontal shaft gas or steam-powered engine, and it was called a capstone winch. It was similar to this, and you would wrap the rope around it. You'd make a wrap like that, and you'd have to pull on one end of the rope while that head spun around, and as you kept the tension with that wrap around it, that's what would pull the trap up. But in order to stop the trap from coming up, you would have to unravel that really quick, or you would haul the whole trap through your block and you'd end up with just splinters. So it was a huge learning curve when guys left that hand hauling and started to either get those gas-powered haulers or even the hydraulic ones that we use nowadays. I mean, even for myself, as I've gone up in boat sizes, there's a huge learning curve. Like every now and then our rope will get stuck on a sharp rock or something on the bottom, and it will be snagged. And when I had a smaller boat, I'd just tie the rope off to the end of the boat, and I'd put the boat in gear and go around and around until it popped. And eventually it would come. Well, I tried that when I got a bigger boat, and the rope just snapped. Because the boat had that much more buoyancy and was that much heavier than the small boat used to be. And It just, the rope couldn't take that strength of it. So there's still that learning curve today, that there was back then. Guys back then, if you look at some of the older guys, I mean, their hands are just, you look at the size of their hands and the size of their fingers. They had so much strength in their hands and their fingers because they used those for everything they did. Like I said, with those worms, if you lost the wooden traps, eventually they would be eaten pretty quickly. There wasn't much left on the bottom. The twine that you used back then wasn't synthetic, it was cotton, so that would even biodegrade. Most of the twine we use now, it came out in the late 60s, early 70s, the synthetic type of stuff. It lasts much longer. Back in the day, the guys had to hand knit their heads. Everybody would hand knit their heads, and if you had a good fishing trap, you would sometimes have to hand knit 2 or 3 sets of heads for a year, because the lobsters would wear those heads out just crawling in and out of the trap, because that cotton just didn't have the strength that the synthetics do nowadays. So guys would spend the winter hand knitting their heads. They'd knit several hundred more than they needed because they know they were going to have to replace those heads. So not only were they building their traps, they were building their rope, they were building their heads, they were building their buoys, building their houses. Farming, life was just nothing but work back then. Nobody took vacations. You just worked. And I could certainly understand why the life expectancy wasn't that long back then. I wouldn't want to live much longer than 40 either, working all those years. As the synthetics and stuff came out and the wire traps came out, there was less work, but you started adding more trash too. As you can see here now, the wire traps, it takes years and years and years for those wire traps to rust away. They're made out of steel and they're coated in vinyl, and in order for steel to rust, it needs to be exposed to air. So if the traps are stuck on bottom, there's very little air down there, and it takes a significant amount of time for a trap to rust away. We do not like and try to never lose traps. I carry a grapple on my boat, so if the rope breaks on me, it's a great big hook. I throw it overboard and I tow it around until I either catch my trap or I run out of time, and I'm pretty good. I'd say 90% of the time I can get the trap back. But every now and then you can't. And this is what happens, is these traps will sit on bottom and they roll around and they gather up more traps and more rope, and you just haul up these giant balls. This ball here was on the southern end of Ragged Island, and it was about the size of a full-size Chevy. The whole thing, it was, thousands and thousands of pounds. It actually ended up on the southern end of Ragged Island after those January 2024 storms. It finally pushed it ashore. That ball of traps had been rolling around there for 10, 12 years. We all knew about it. We all just tried to stay away from it. But every now and then, you would snag into it, and it was a mess. In the early 1900s, guys used to just fish singles, and then it became more efficient to tie more than one trap onto a buoy, what we call trawls or strings, and that eliminated some of the work. They didn't need as many buoys then because you only need one buoy, and then you'd have what they call a ground line with 5 to 20 traps attached to it. So you could eliminate the number of buoys you needed. But as wire traps started coming out, there was still no trap limit at that point. Guys were fishing in the early 80s up until the early 90s. There were guys that had 2,000 to 3,000 traps out there, and then in the mid-90s, the federal government put trap limits on us, and we're only allowed to have 800 now. This is pogie fishing. This is a seine full of pogies here, and this is how they would catch them back in the day as well. One of the problems, like I was saying in the beginning, is guys would go fish for lobsters until lobsters dried up, and then they'd go shrimping. Well, in 1970, NOAA came into existence, the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. They were the agency that began regulating fisheries. And that's when we started to see seasons, quotas, permits. And we hear about overfishing, and it has happened with some fisheries, but in my opinion, part of the reason that has happened is the government. before, like I said, you could go fish what you wanted, when you wanted. When Noah came in, they put seasons on something, and they said you can only catch X number amount of it. So before, a guy would go out and catch just enough, only what he needed. Now they're telling you, well, you're only allowed 1,000 pounds, and if you don't catch that 1,000 pounds next year, it's only going to be 900. So guys would go out and catch the maximum amount they were allowed to, so their quotas didn't get reduced. And they would partake in overfishing some of those times, just so, because they were nervous, if this gets caught and the market goes, is that going to be enough fish for me to be able to provide for my family? So they would always try to catch that quota so they never lost quota. I mean, we still see that today with the glass eels that guys catch. This year, for example, those guys have no market. The price the last 7 to 10 years has been between $1,500 and $2,500 a pound. This year's $200. But they're still going out and they're going to catch their quota, because the Department of Marine Resources has told them if you don't catch the quota, your quota is going to get slashed. So they're going to fill the quota just so they don't lose it next year, in hopes that the market rebounds next year. But if that quota wasn't there, those guys wouldn't be fishing right now. They just let those eels swim up the river, do their spawning, and go back. It really isn't financially worth it for them, but they have to maintain that quota. So the other thing that happened a little after that was the Magnuson-Stevenson Act in 1976, which created the Economic Exclusion Zone, which is 200 miles off the coast of the United States. No foreign vessels are allowed to come inside that line and fish anymore. What was happening in the 70s, in the 60s, and the 50s, and probably even before then, is you had a lot of these what I call factory ships, the Russians, the Chinese. They were coming into our bays here and catching all the fish, a lot more than what guys around. I mean, these were massive factory ships. And we created the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, which forced them outside of that 200 miles and left everything 200 miles in to U.S. fishermen. And because of that, that's why you don't see any of those foreign vessels. And I think that's where a lot of your overfishing happened back in the day, was when you had these big factory ships from other countries coming in. And I remember, even my dad gave me, when I was born, my dad used to go out and meet up with one of the Russian boats, and he'd trade vodka for little trinkets. And they'd give him all these cool, they were like Happy Meal toys. They were these little figurines and stuff. And he saved them, and he gave them to me when I was a kid. They'd trade you. I mean, they trade for vodka, they trade for fish, lobsters, but they were big on trading with local people around here and stuff like that. But they were also good at overfishing, so the Magnuson-Stevenson Act wasn't a bad thing. And this is just another picture of us pogie fishing. This is the coolest thing that I have ever caught myself, lobster, and this is exactly how it came up. You can see this is a lobster trap here, and this is a seahorse, obviously. Here it is in my hand. But he had wrapped his tail around the end of the trap. I was mesmerized. I'd been fishing my whole life, desperately wanted to catch a seahorse, finally caught one, put it in a bucket, looked up on the internet what it ate, went and got a bunch of food for it, put it in the bucket, brought it in. I called up the aquarium down in Booth Bay. I was going to donate it to them. Said, look, I got a seahorse I want to give to you guys. I've kept it alive. I'm feeding it. They go, how many do you have? I go, I just have one. What do you mean, how many do I have? Like, I've worked 35 years to get one. And they're like, oh, we don't want it. I go, what do you mean? They go, they mate for life. If you separate them from their mate, they will literally die of depression. So I felt like a really big bag. And that's this seahorse here, because I tried to feed it, and it lasted about 3 or 4 days, and unfortunately it did pass away. I've caught 6 more since then. Whenever I catch one now, I usually find it after I set the string out. I've never found one on a trap like that again. So I'll set the string out, I'll be riding to my next one, I'll see it on the rail or on the deck. I grab it, I turn around, I steam back to the string I just hauled, I haul it back up, and I put the seahorse in it, and I set it back out. Because that's the best I could do to get it back to its mate, But fishermen are, and it's like Lily said at the beginning, we're one of the most helpful group of individuals. There's people that wouldn't give me the time of day on land, but if I was in trouble out on the water, they would come and pick me up without blinking an eye. And there's people that I feel the same way about, but if they're in trouble out there on the ocean, I don't care who you are, I'm coming to help you. And that's the only reason that we still have fisheries today, is because we're willing to help each other out. And the biggest threat that we're facing here in Harpswell now is gentrification. And it's like I said, back to the Indians. The white people came here, forced all the Indians out. We're starting to see it repeat itself. Harpswell is still the biggest fishing community in the state of Maine. There are more licensed lobstermen, pogie fishermen, and clammers in the town of Harpswell than any other town in Maine. But that has, in my 41 years, that has dropped in more than half. And it is exponentially increasing as the price of real estate has skyrocketed. It's become harder and harder for fishermen to maintain a place in the communities where they've been generationally, because as people get older and they're in this house that's been passed down generation after generation. For example, like I said, I grew up at the head of Cundy's Harbor there. It's a small white ranch. My great-grandparents bought the land for $500 and built the camp for $2,500. It's worth well over $1 million now. And as people get older and their health starts to fail, if you don't have a savings or a retirement and you have to go into a home or something like that, that is the only money you have. And if somebody's standing at your door going, $1 million, and you're going, I need 10 more years to live, and this is the only way I'm going to do it, they're forced to sell out. And once we lose that access, we never get it back. The Island Institute did a study several years ago. Maine has more coastline than just about any other state besides Alaska. There's over 3,000 miles of coastline, and less than 20 miles of it is for commercial fishing access. So, that just speaks to back in the 1940s and 50s, you had 72% of this town. Access was everywhere. There was public landings everywhere. Every house that was on the harbor or on the water was a fisherman or a fishing family, and that just isn't the case anymore. And that will be the death of the fishing industry, in my opinion, is just loss of access. If you can't get to the water, you can't fish. So that's something that, and I'll use clammers for example. I see a lot now. What happens is clammers will have a handshake agreement with somebody, yeah, you can walk across my property, and they'll give them some free clams, at the end of the year, once a month or something. Well, say January, that person sells their house, the clammer's not clamming then, and there's usually ice on the bays, and they don't tell the new homeowner that they have this handshake agreement. The clammer shows back up in July, starts walking across the property. All of a sudden, the cops are called for trespassing because the new owner doesn't know who this person is. They just came from Boston. Somebody's walking through your yard. It's not a good thing. And it's just a disconnect where a little bit of communication, or some easements or a little bit more than a handshake agreement can go a long ways for guys. Access is the biggest thing we need. Without access, we have no fishery. And I guess that's all I got.